and that is terrorism. Not how to do it, but how the media cope with it and what we can learn if we educate the public. I learned that Bryn's camera is not working, it's broken down, but at least it's not hijacked. So he cannot share his visual, but he can share the screen. So Bryn, I would ask you to take over, and I step back and the screen is yours. We cannot hear you so far.
I'm hoping you can hear me now.
Yes, perfect.
That's excellent. And can you see the slides? Can everyone see the slides okay?
Perfect.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Uwe. And may I say how grateful I am to be with you today. And thank you, Uwe, for inviting me and for arranging this conference. And it's a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. So I hope that I can offer some thoughts on how best we went about this process of educating the people about the issues of terrorism. And I'm delighted to say that it is an area in which I teach, as Uwe says, not the practical side of things, but actually the history and what we can learn about teaching people about the realities of terrorism. And in my other life, I teach politics and history at Swansea University. Indeed, this morning I was teaching Richard Nixon, so that was always a pleasure. And indeed, part of my job is also internationalization, interestingly enough, of students both incoming and outgoing. That's one of the more pleasurable aspects of my job, internationalization within the university. But I'm also delighted to say, and this is the first time she's ever done anything like this, so she's delighted to be joining me today, my wife. So I would like her to be able to say hello to you all.
Hi, I'm Susan Wilcock. I'm the manager of the Waterstones bookshop in Swansea, where we conducted this research project. And I'll be talking a little bit later about how we encourage community participation in the project.
So thank you, Susan. So yes, Susan will be joining me. She has her own little section as we progress through the slides. So hopefully we're all sitting comfortably. So hopefully the slides will now move on. Indeed, they will. Excellent. So the problem that we faced ultimately is this perennial problem of how we get the public involved. To say something about where we live in South Wales. It's a beautiful city. It's by the sea. It's not especially large. It's a population of around about 230,000, give or take. And it's a nice area, but there isn't much, shall we say, if you were to appear in somewhere like London, somewhere like that, you would have both a wider community and an opportunity to speak to more people. Here in Swansea, there's not normally any kind of, shall we say, precedent for getting people involved in projects like this. So we were starting from a lower base of interest because people weren't used to this. But it is a very important part of what we would like to do, to involve the wider public outside of the corridors of academia in projects such as this. And it's not going to be easy. We all have long list of things that we have to do with our time, everything from looking after families to preparing for work and so on. So we're aware that people's time is limited. They might have an interest, they might want to take part, but there's always going to be the question of timing. There's always going to be the question of how people find out about such projects. And there's also going to be the issue of how you get them through the door to take part. Now, I know these are perennial questions, but what I would like to do is explain how we went about solving them, and indeed how we involved aspects of internationalization within our project to try to get an indication of how important such an additional variable, such as internationalization, would be. And I also want to stress as well that we were very, very keen to make sure that we had a representative sample of people taking part in any project that we put together. We recognized straight away that we had to involve as many people as possible, but these people had to be as diverse as possible, making sure that we represented the true makeup of the city in which this was taking place. So these were all problems that we faced. We set out to offer an opportunity for people to get involved, but we also recognized that this was always going to be a challenge. Bear with me, these slides. There we are, they do move on. Hopefully you can see the topic as Uwe very kindly prefaced. We decided to take the issue of terrorism. And why do that? Well, it's an area that I've been teaching in for many, many years. You can imagine what 9/11 did in terms of interest in the subject. But even prior to 9/11, I first taught terrorism or aspects of terrorism in the late 90s. There was an interest then, but it exploded naturally after 9/11. It's never left the news since. And we wanted this topic partly because we thought it would be of interest. So as we pointed out, it's contemporary, it's relevant, and we thought it's also an area where people perhaps might want to know a little bit more. Yes, to an extent, people know something about it, but not as much perhaps as they thought maybe they'd like to know. And perceptions of terrorism are very, very interesting and often don't reflect reality. So this was a topic in which we thought we might get some interest, but might also be valuable to the wider community in learning about a topic that was of interest to them, of relevance to them, but in which ultimately perhaps their understanding was not as strong as it might have been. And we also realized quite early on that we could involve internationalization in this. And indeed, we moved to bring in an American voice, because if there's one country in the world, in the West particularly, where terrorism has been top of the agenda, even more so than Britain, it is, of course, the United States. So we were fortunate enough to be able to bring in an internationalization voice right from the start of the project to see what impact that had. So I thought I mean, some of the slides in the conference are so beautifully illustrated, and I feel bad that I haven't been able to illustrate mine in quite the way that I would have liked. But I did want to produce this picture. I took this picture, actually. It's remarkable how many students actually enjoy you putting holiday pictures into their lectures, actually. They actually comment on that in their appraisal form. So I'm always happy to include my holiday pictures. But this seemed particularly relevant because, as you can see, this is a picture I took of the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The interesting thing about this picture is, first off, I almost put my back out taking it. But secondly, I visited the World Trade Centers in 1993, the very year when there was the first terrorist attack. You might even remember that. In February 1993, there was a massive truck bomb explosion in the basement. And the intention was to blow up one trade center and make it fall onto the other. And you can see from this picture, actually, that was surprisingly more viable than you might have thought. So the intention of the original attack was to kill 250,000 people. And the man responsible for that attack, Ramzi Youssef, is now in a supermax jail in Colorado. But I thought I'd just include that because throughout my teaching, I try to make sure that I bring the topic alive for people. And I try to do the same when we spoke to the public, when we involved them in this project. So how did we involve the public? Well, this is perhaps something that you might be able to guess. We used a mix of old and new techniques. Naturally, we incorporated use of the internet and social media, the inevitable use of Facebook, and of course, Twitter. Now, involving those meant that we could attract a certain number of people, but we were also aware that not everyone is on social media. And we wanted to make sure that more traditional forms of communication were also utilized. And Susan helped with that, and she will say something about that very shortly. We were also aware that we wanted to encourage people to come along, and that although we weren't about to give them any kind of financial reward for their time, we did want to show that we were appreciative of the fact that they gave up their time and the fact they were giving up some of their busy lives to take part in such a project. So I kind of used a little bit of bribery by using tea and coffee and indeed mince pies and chocolates, a little bit of gentle reward, if you like, a little bit of bribery, which I think was appreciated because very often people are more inclined, I think, to take part if they feel just a little bit appreciated. So I did invest in some refreshments and something that they could munch on whilst they were listening to our work. So at this point, I am delighted to say that you get a change of voice, and talking about the central location and how we got involved in all of this, and I brought my wife in, I'm going to bring in Susan to tell you more about that.
Okay, I'm going to start at the bottom of this slide and with the task of finding a suitable location. The obvious choice for a research project would have been the university, but this presented a number of problems. The university is not in a central location in Swansea. It has very limited visitor parking facilities, and it can be difficult for members of the public to find particular lecture theatres. Making it difficult for people to attend meant we ran the risk of ending up with a largely academic audience, which would have compromised the research, as we wanted to look at wider community participation. By choosing a location in the city centre, we can maximise how inclusive we could be of the wider community. This is where I became involved with the project. As manager of a large bookshop in the centre of town, I was experienced in holding events in store, from book launches to workshops and exhibitions. And as part of a chain, we cater to a wide demographic. We're also a very well-known historic building in the centre of the city, so easy for everyone to find. Here you can see two photos of the bookshop I'm fortunate to work in. It's a beautiful building, as you can see. The one on the left is from its previous incarnation as a cinema, and on the right is how it looks now. It was originally built in 1914, so it's been at the heart of the community in Swansea for over 100 years. On the top floors, we have event space with seating, and this is where we held the sessions. Okay. By utilising a high street location, it also meant that we could advertise in the location in advance, in the weeks and months running up, rather than having to find a room to rent somewhere and then having to advertise elsewhere. In store, I was able to put up posters in the windows in our cafe, create displays of relevant books to draw attention to the project. It also meant that we could reach out to our older customers, many of whom don't have access to social media channels. And so helping out with the wider community participation that we were looking for. Okay. At this point, I will hand you back to Bryn.
Oh, thank you, Susan. And Susan was instrumental in effectively being able to help organise such a project, because by bringing in a central location, a place where people knew, a place where people enjoyed visiting, it was a bit more of an experience. I suppose the problem lies is if you invite people, as Susan mentioned, to a lecture theatre, well, first off, that's not very inclusive, is it? It's very daunting for people not used to lecture theatres to feel comfortable in an environment like that. So that was another reason why you think, let's move to somewhere a little bit more welcoming, a little bit more inviting. But also it becomes a destination because they think, well, actually, I'm here, I'm in town, I can continue my shopping, I can go and have lunch if I wish. So it wasn't, we were asking them to go to a pretty anonymous location in which they then would listen to us and then simply depart. There was a destination in itself in the form of the town centre. So this was almost perfect for us. There's no venue that ideally fits every single potential demographic, but this was as wide as we felt we could go. The number of people who we could approach in a bookshop was wide enough for us to make this project much more viable than it would have been simply if we'd have advertised on the internet. So as Susan points out, what you have here is the ability to advertise in more traditional forms. And this helped us get a representative sample of the public. Now, of course, there is another question that always dogs such projects. When do you hold them? And we're all aware, I'm sure, there is no such thing as an ideal time. There's always time when we have things to do. And if we don't, we might want to jealously guard that time to relax or do the things we've been meaning to catch up with all week. Saturday was an obvious time slot, but the problem with Saturday is you create what we would term sporting widows, people who sit alone in the shop because their husbands are at home or at sporting events or watching the rugby, Wales after all I'm speaking from, or football, or I just thought I'd put this picture in as a more gentle occupation, maybe the snooker or whatever. So what we didn't want is a room full of people who were keen to get away from the sporting action. So when to hold? In the end, Sundays was decided upon. Now this, of course, is not perfect, because people also have things on a Sunday, family meals, church attendance, many things which would still get in the way of their ability to attend. However, we got round this by holding events at different times of the day. And in addition to that, we tried to make sure that we held it on a day when such things as free parking existed. The thing about on Sundays, there's no parking charges. So anyone that did come in, particularly specifically for this event, were not charged for journeying in. So in the end, Sundays won, but not perfect, but the best we thought available, the best time available. So to say something more about internationalization, given that we are at the HES conference here, it was decided very early on to bring in an international voice, and this worked. This was something which people responded to well. So we decided to carve the groups up between those that would have an international voice and those that would be purely listening to a British voice. So there was an opportunity to listen to the topic. The topic would be delivered in the same way, but the voice would be different. To hear about how people dealt with the issue of terrorism, the threats of terrorism, both here and in America, where, as we said right at the outset, this is an even bigger topic than it has proved to be in Britain over the last 20 years. But the internationalization part of our project proved to be extremely interesting and extremely rewarding. So let me just move on to our next slide. To say a little bit about what we did, this is terrorism. It is an area of concern as well of interest to people. So we wanted to test what they felt about the topic based on statements. And that's very important. We didn't want them feeling we were testing them or giving them any kind of anxiety related to what we were doing. They're not students. We're not trying to give them a degree. We're not trying to teach in the same way that I would at the university. So how people felt about the issue of terrorism, both before, immediately after, and 3 months later. And they gave us very interesting results. But the great thing about what we did was the ability to find out that the international component made a difference, an appreciable difference to what we did. And let me say something more about how that was achieved. To me, I think it was the ability to hear a different voice. Not something people often hear, particularly here in Swansea, something that was important to hear about the topic from a different perspective. And I think the mere difference of voice and tone and outlook was very interesting. And it also revealed to us that it did have a greater impact on our study. So if I move forward here, you will see that when we got the results back, and obviously I won't talk so much about the results here because of time, we're almost done. But the impact was much greater. There was a much greater level of change in people's reactions, having listened to the international component that we brought in. And even more interestingly, was the fact that when we chased this up 3 months later, that impact was still evident. So we would certainly like to expand this internationalization. We feel there's scope for it. We would love to know more about how different voices of internationalization can help the communities, help them to learn, help them to get different perspectives, to break down barriers, ultimately. So there are problems, of course. I wish I could say we got hundreds and hundreds of people coming through the doors. And I wish we could say that we could use all respondents. We couldn't, because not everyone did the follow-up survey. And we had to make sure that all the groups were perfectly balanced in terms of age, sex, and educational background. And when that didn't happen, we had to miss certain people out in order to achieve the correct balance. But it was rewarding, and it did show how we can do several things. We can bring people out from the community into the center of town and address topics of concern and importance to them. And one of the ways that this might be the most efficacious way of proceeding is to bring in the concepts of internationalization, to bring a different voice in, to take me and other academics out of our ivory towers and into the communities. But they don't just want to hear from me. They want to hear from different voices, additional voices, people who can give them alternative perspectives and points of view. And so internationalization not only played a role in our research, but showed that it made a true difference to what we were doing. And I would love to go further with such ideas in the future to see where internationalization and its involvement in the local communities may take us. Let me thank you for your time.
Well, this is so much on the spot in terms of time. Is very impressive. I would say leave the conclusions on, and we can wait for people to come in terms of questions. What I really find very interesting in the project, and I was just lucky to help a little bit with the data analysis, was more how much time you spend on really making it relevant to the community, not only in content, but also in terms of location. And that is something that I wanted to ask Susan in a way, as somebody representing, the wider public. What would you think? How could this be maybe transferred somewhere else? How could other cities do similar things? What do you think? But also Britain, of course.
Yes, I mean, obviously, being married to a university lecturer, I have attended many university events, both in Swansea and around the country. But yeah, you do go to a university event and it does feel slightly intimidating because you are surrounded by all of these academics and very intelligent people. And especially when it comes to questions and answers, you might not feel that your input is valid, that you might not want to take part in the discussion at the end. And yes, I remember a while ago, we did go to an event in Oxford, and that was held at an outside venue, not on university grounds. And that did feel much more relaxed and inclusive. And again, that was advertised to the wider community, and yeah, just took it out of the ivory tower.
Yes, I think one of the things that we could do is try to develop this as something people get used to. And that's the challenge. The problem is if you do it as a one-off event or a series of one-off events, people might be interested, people might come, but then they quickly get out of the habit of this. And I think it's easier in big cities. This is what I was alluding to earlier. If you've got a big population centers such as London or Birmingham or Bristol or Berlin or Prague or whatever, you have straight away, you have a dimension there which is more international, which just has a larger population, a larger demographic potentially. But in other cities such as the one in which we live, there is no precedent for these kind of things. So you're almost starting from scratch. And I feel that if we did them more regularly, if people were encouraged to come, I think it would establish perhaps an opportunity to really get people more involved. It's just difficult when you do it so infrequently. And I also think the internationalization aspect would help in that, because if you're saying, actually, this isn't just an academic here, you're going to hear voices from around the world, from different perspectives. I think people genuinely have an interest in that. I think people would want to hear from the wider international community. And the bookshop was helpful in that, because you've got a kind of receptive market, really. Hopefully Brexit hasn't skewed people's interpretations of Britain. I think actually we do have an interest in what goes on around the world. And I do think that there is an opportunity here to take such an idea wider. But the problem lies that if we just do this as a one-off, then people will never get used to it as an activity. So you're always starting from scratch, and that's the greatest problem, I think. But in the bigger cities, one would have thought there's more scope.
Absolutely. And I mean, we should also be very clear about, I mean, you were quite modest when you said that there were, substantial results, because for those in the audience who are interested in the scientific side of it, I mean, we found highly significant differences between, first of all, between the international group and the purely British taught group, right? But also we found highly significant changes from the opinions before and after in all of the participants. So that for me, always the two messages are, on the one hand, it is very, very worthwhile to bring in university knowledge into society. And secondly, it's even more worthwhile doing it if we can bring in the international, because what we did and what you did there with this approach is it was a 100% experimental design, and that means that the significance proves causality. So it's not just by chance what happened, even though it was not hundreds of people.
Thank you. I can see that Jan has very kindly posted a question here, which I'm just reading now. And it's a very good question, how to be less intimidating. And that's at the core, isn't it? Really, how do you make this less intimidating? And how do we get closer to the community? And although there's no easy answer to that, I like to think that what I can do perhaps is, as best as possible, try to communicate to the people that we are angling this at them. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be straightforward, because people are intimidated and people are put off by the academic world, especially in cities like this one. So I don't know which city you're in, Jan, but you might face a similar problem. How do we encourage people to come in? And one way of doing that is to try and make sure that every message that you send them, whether it be on social media or via leaflets from the shop or posters, and even the way that I discuss the event with people, is as welcoming and as encouraging and as open as possible. But it's very difficult because people straight away are intimidated. And that's an excellent word to use. When they think about university, they might have no experience with it whatsoever. And it does become something that they're almost put off, and overcoming that barrier is a real challenge. And all I can think of is that we make absolutely clear that this is for them, and that if anything, they could gain from this. And we are trying, if anything, to break down these barriers that we recognize are there.
Yeah. And I think the more of these events we do in the community, the more we do break down the barriers between the university and the town. So yeah, I think just forging more links is the important.
And Jan told us you're from Brno, which is Milan Kundera's home city, is it not? Or did I dream that?
And it's particularly a very, very international city with one of the most international universities in the Czech Republic, Masaryk. So it has slight advantages over Swansea, where I also lived, in that respect. And yes, you were right, Bryn. By the way, just on the side, whatever you do, and when you travel to the United Kingdom and you visit Swansea and you visit maybe Bryn, don't try one thing. Don't try to beat him in any pub quiz. You have not the chance of a snowball in hell. I tell that from experience. We have the option for one last question, either from the audience or from myself. So I give it a chance to the audience. Otherwise, what I would like to ask as a final thing for both of you is, what would be the one topic that you would think a university should use to do something like you did in a different country, if you could choose it? What would be the topic you would feel, or in a different city in the UK?
Well, that's a good question. And it depends on the location. If you're talking about the UK, I would love to educate people more on Brexit, although that might be a little bit like the horse has already bolted. And I would love to teach more on terrorism, not because I'm trying to sell anything. I'm not trying to persuade them of anything, but I'm just trying to get them to think about the topic in terms of what its actual historical background is, or what its genuine threat level is. If I were overseas internationally, The question that I'm most asked when people find out what you do is, please explain Donald Trump. So
And you could.
Internationally, I could say more about that. That is the question that I'm most asked.
Thank you. Final thing, Susan, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, the only other topic I would really suggest is immigration, because I think it's one of the more important topics of our time. And especially with climate change, it's only going to put more pressure on countries' borders in the future. And how we deal with that is going to be very important.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And that should also leave us already then, unfortunately, with closing down this session, because the time is up, quick as it is. And I thank you very much, both of you, that you made it online to this event. Long travel.